Welcome to the second in the series of the Prelude Talks. These are bespoke online series which lead towards Headspace 2018, an event on March 2nd and 3rd here in Trinity College in Dublin that presents scientific and creative investigation into the determinants of a healthy brain. Speakers are the ambassadors from diverse disciplines. They indicate the territory of Headspace 2018, which has twin ambitions of approaching complex issues with innovation and seeking knowledge from a diversity of expertise to bring fresh insight into enduring challenges. Last week, Kate Goodwin, who's the head of architecture and the Drew Hines curator at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, gave an eloquent, considered and groundbreaking talk about architecture and well-being. Today, Dominic Campbell, who's the co-founder of Creative Ageing International, will talk about celebration as strategy. Later on in the series, we have David Cotterill talking about the limits of empathy. David is an installation artist working across media and technologies to explore the social and political tendencies of a world at once shared and divided. He's the research professor in fine art at the Faculty of Arts, Computing, Engineering and Science at Sheffield Hallam University, with work commissioned and shown extensively in Europe, the USA and Asia. He'll be followed by Felicity Callard, who's the Professor of Social Research and the Director of the Burbank Institute for Social Research, who'll be talking about the social self. And then we will be talking with Alice Thwaite, who talks about improving older people's lives through creativity. What connects them? In their own practice, each speaker examines the relationship between information gathering, decision-making and delivery. They operate across systems of knowledge and understanding, often wrestling with how knowledge is formed and articulated, how power is engaged with, and systemic bias is countered. We have invited each to talk at the edge of their comfort zone, at the edge of what they know. Next up today is Dominic Campbell, who will be talking about celebration as strategy. A cultural producer, Dominic is also the curator of this series as the co-founder of Creative Ageing International. An Atlantic Fellow in Equity and Brain Health at the Global Brain Health Institute between Trinity College, Dublin and University College in San Francisco. He is also the former director of St. Patrick's Festival, Inaugural Arts Festival and the nationwide month-long celebration of creativity and ageing, Bealtaine. So over to you, Dominic.
Beginnings. Beginnings are curious things. Where to start? Where to start talking about celebration as strategy? My mother died today, or was it yesterday? Is how Albert Camus began L'étranger. Or there's Once Upon a Time, which is much more easy to live with. It's where we start and which point of view that we take at the start of a story lines it up, it sets the tone. And so today's talk will be partly about the space between things. It will be, for instance, about the space between those two very different types of beginning, the one that says, that places us in a long narrative once upon a time, or the one that says, actually we can shape everything. What we're going to look at is we're going to look at the stories that we're telling ourselves and how we're telling them. We're going to look at how we might change them and the tools that we might use. It will relate to other talks in this series because they're made by people who are very much working across things. What we did when we were looking at the speakers for this series is begin to look for hyphens. Hyphens have become like small flags in sentences. They're where a little flag that says, actually, neither of these nouns can hold the ideas that are bubbling up through this sector. And so we have two ideas, we have two nouns placed together, and between them, a little hyphen, a little flag. So they're flags for where emergent new ideas are coming from, where stories are changing. Stories like neuro-science or medical-humanities, each of which uses story as metaphor, for instance, for the way that our neurons connect all the tactile experience and we string that together as a narrative to make sense of it, to make a story from it. But what kind of story? If I was starting this talk in Australia, the very beginning of the talk would begin with a thing called the Welcome to Country. It's an acknowledgement of the traditional people on whose lands that we're standing and speaking. And for me, it's a really great way of remembering tradition, of remembering that we're part of this much longer narrative, that we stand on the shoulders of giants. So for example, I would not be here were it not for a broad health service. I simply wouldn't have made it this far. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for a state investment in education. And I probably wouldn't be here if unionisation at some stage hadn't led to people in service labour having more than one day off a year. The idea of me even being conceived would probably have been incredible for people working on that kind of timescale. So all of these things lead to the me. They're the story of me. And which piece you give credence to as the tool of change depends very much on your point of view within that story. Is that a story of the development of history? Is that a story of social change? Is that a story of medical innovation? You know, it's the old adage about the fact that to a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. Surgeons respond to people in a very particular way that might not be the same as a sociologist. Are we talking about an illness? Are we talking about a patient? Point of view. And the challenge with something that's incredibly complex, like the development of Alzheimer's and dementia and longevity of populations, is how do we connect these very different worldviews? When you talk to someone like a novelist or a playwright, to a trader in tales, they have a very different way of talking about story. What they're obsessed with, more than anything, is the form of a tale. It's as if they're looking for an architecture that allows that story to assemble around the architecture. As if it's an organic culture growing around but needs a frame to grow around. As if it needs connective tissue, the connective tissue of a form. So, for example, they would look at something like the collapse of Enron and the subsequent failure of economy as a very closed story, and the conversation would be, how do we open up that story? And that brings me to my fourth point. How do we open up the systems that we build? How do we open up the stories that we build ourselves? How do we open up the cultures that we link ourselves with through story? And how these stories build around a very particular viewpoint. So, how do we look at the stories that we're telling ourselves? How do we connect different worldviews? And I take comfort in the fact that this is possible by thinking about the structure of a Russian novel. So a Russian novel, one of the ways of looking at it is that the story begins a long time ago. It begins way over here. And these characters poodle along. And when I pick up the book, they come in through the first page into the story that I read, and I stay with them. And they disappear through the back page and they continue. The story's already started, and we enter it at a certain point. So when we face complex societal shifts, like the increased alignment between longevity and related incidents of dementia and Alzheimer's, the choice of where we start the story is complex. We join the story in the middle. And if this story fails to move from fiction into action, it remains about as useful as clicking like. It's a nod in the direction of change, but no more. So where do I personally start? Well, personally, I start with the arts. I start with arts and health. Arts is my expertise, but my expertise is as particular as surgeons would be. It's very particular and rooted. I'm primarily a carnivalist, and Carnival is incredibly complex and incredibly simple. It really begins with something as simple as a hat. So Carnival starts with the sensation that you have when you put on a different hat and you become a different person, or you try a new haircut, or you try a new costume, a new set of clothes, or you might dress up as a king or a queen for a day and you become that king or a queen. You embody belief in the possibility of becoming something other. You embody belief in the possibility of hope, that change is possible, that new and evolved stories can be told. I can dress as a king, I can maybe become a king. You're playing with an idea and imagining possibility. You start to lay a story across reality, and a gap opens in the middle in which change and the possibility of change arrives, which plays directly into something like behavioural psychology, where we imagine that we can become something else, that a new opportunity is possible, and we'll come to that later on. Carnival is very much about connecting people. It's about convening. It's about active convening, getting people together to make a thing happen, which comes around year after year after year and becomes a tradition and becomes a habit and becomes just what we do, becomes a behavioural change. It allows for the possibility of astonishment and wonder. And astonishment and wonder in a neuroscience framing, from a neuroscience viewpoint, are beginning to be seen as almost the opposite to loneliness and isolation. So, carnivals and their related contemporary cousins festivals are ways that we might prototype a new type of reality, a new type of behaviour, a new culture of well-being and health. So that brings us specifically to Alzheimer's and dementia. It brings us specifically to thinking about how do we live better for longer, and how might celebration be a strategy for change. So I'll keep coming back to those 5 points as I go. And what I want to do now, having kind of set it up, is start to look at those in detail. The Atlantic Fellowship talks about the challenges of Alzheimer's and dementia globally. Its mission statement suggests that the aim is to seek societal and public health solutions to reduce the scale and adverse impacts of dementia, to make significant progress towards prevention, cure and treatment for dementia through an interprofessional training programme and access to a global network of mentors and colleagues, to translate research evidence and innovation into informed and effective policy and practice. Hugely complex and ambitious ambitions, which I take really to just mean fix it. What is it we're trying to fix? Can you boil that down into something that I can grasp hold of? Well, we know that this is a global issue. It's a challenge that stretches beyond country, that as the miracle of longer lives, as the miracle of public health means that people live longer, there is an increased incidence of people living with dementia. And we know that because of that, there are many, many different types of effects. We know that this miracle of longer lives are unique. So last year, 2017, is the first year when across Europe more people were alive above the age of 65 than under the age of 5 for the first time in European history. So it's unique. We never have travelled into this territory. We don't know what this new reality is going to look like. And we don't know what happens with all the issues that build out from that simple fact of people living longer. If we look at one particular country, like America, currently has 40 million people, aged 65 and older. That's set to increase to 89 million by 2050. It has the richest generation in world history. But amongst that generation, it also has amongst the poorest and most fragile people. So it's a very complicated societal picture. And it's more complicated when we start to look at the social determinants of ageing and the social determinants of health. Between 30 and 50% of what affects our health is environmental. It's not biological, it's not genealogical. So what that means in the longer term is that people don't age at the same time. Chronology and aging are not all the time connected. They can be unpicked. So for example, depending on your postcode, it might well be that your healthy life expectancy is between 6 and 8 years shorter, simply because of which part of the city that you live in, simply because of your educational attainments, simply because of your environmental impact issues. So aging isn't the sole indicator. Chronology isn't the same sole indicator of aging. And so we're looking at two things. We're looking at longevity, increase in longevity. We're looking at a rise in incidence of Alzheimer's and dementia that aligns with that increase in longevity. And we're looking at major changes in the way that people live their lives. So for example, my father is now about 78. His life expectancy is round about 80. His father would have died about 3 years after he retired, so 65, 67, 68, which was standard for people of his generation. My nephews and nieces who are in their teens have something like a 50% chance of living to be centenarians. So the way that we live our lives is beginning to change. People in their 50s are starting second careers. People who have worked all their lives to place their assets in physical property with the idea that they pass that on to their next generation are beginning to question that, because if large numbers of people at the age of 90 have children who are 70, who have children who are 50, who have children who are 30, who have teenagers, what happens to succession? What happens to the generational contract? And then between countries, the inequity that results as a result of longer lives is increasing. So if I wake up in Dublin and I fly to South Africa in the same time zone, I start life as a middle-aged man, and I land in South Africa where the average age of a grandparent is 44, and my worldview and place in that world has changed dramatically. So these significant complex issues are beginning to play out in individual sectors. They play out in the financial sector, where people are looking at what happens with pensions and health investment. They're playing out in the health sector, where we're looking at a health sector that's built on the idea of acute conditions. So people go to a health hospital, to a black box model, maybe with a broken arm, it's fixed, and they go back home. Where we have older populations living longer with conditions that they live with for a long period of time, that model of a black box system is maybe less appropriate. It's incredibly good at fixing broken bones. It's less good at responding to people living long periods with chronic illness. And those chronic illnesses will come about simply as a matter of living longer. But we could apply the same issues to very many different sectors. We could look at how do we plan for cities that age? How do people use their leisure time? How do we plan for transport and travel for people whose lives are becoming more geographically located? So maybe the questions that we ask ourselves, the ones that begin our stories, are not about how to live longer, but about how to live better. Maybe it's about how do we live longer lives with healthier brains. And when we start to tell that story, the usual way that story is told is by looking at what I think of as the top part of an iceberg. It's looking for more money. It's looking for political support. It's maybe looking to engage with a patient voice so that that patient voice will change the way that the systems are delivered. It's maybe looking for cooperative planning, better messaging. How do we tell the story about living longer with Alzheimer's and dementia? How do we tell that better? But those solutions quite often sit on a more complicated undercurrent. They sit on above the bigger part of the iceberg. And the issues that are at the base of the iceberg, I think, are more maybe difficult to measure, but more influential. They're about cultural habit. They're about the way that behave. They're about ageism. They're about the fact that as people become older, they technically become invisible. The Campaign to End Loneliness in the UK recently pointed out that 220,000 people regularly go more than a month without a significant conversation with a family or friend. And aligned with that are challenges of fear and shame that work both with age, but also with our inability to find a cure currently for Alzheimer's or dementia or neurological conditions. So from a GP's perspective, to repeatedly give a diagnosis without being able to find a solution to that diagnosis is a challenge. How do we deal with that fear that starts to eat away and destroy hope, that leads to the point where people put the challenge, the fear to one side and begin to less engage with what's in front of them, begin possibly less to engage with the value of the individual that's before them. Which brings us back to thinking about viewpoints on stories. So currently, our conception of old age tends to look like a pyramid, where there's a great deal of concentration on people who are frail and in high dependency. there's less on people who are in transition, and those people that are simply 65 or 70 or 75 and are healthy and fine, there's less concern with them, and yet they are the bulk of the population as the generational change moves across. So from a medical biological standpoint, this makes sense. For an acute system, this makes sense. We concentrate on those things that are broken so that we might fix them. We spend less time thinking about transition, and those people that are independent are fine. From a cultural community perspective, maybe we need to change this slightly. We'll always need support for people with frail and high dependency, but maybe we need to work towards a generational change, which will mean engaging with those people currently entering older age, and maybe they become, as we will become, part of the solution to the challenges that we face. Maybe we change the viewpoints a little bit. If we start to look at the stories that we're telling ourselves and the way that we tell them, then do we need to look at where we're telling them from? Which brings me to arts and health. So, if health is about adaptation, understanding and acceptance, then the arts may be more potent than anything that medicine has to offer. Is a quote from Richard Smith in the British Medical Journal, sometime I think during the 1980s. If health is about adaptation, understanding and acceptance, then the arts may be more potent than anything that medicine has to offer. Why? So, if the concern that we have, if the question that we're asking ourselves is, as people age, their circumstances will age regardless of whether they develop Alzheimer's or dementia. If they do develop Alzheimer's or dementia and we currently have no cure for that, then how do people adapt to that individually but also collectively? How do we adapt our understanding of that illness so that the support that does exist, the positives that are possible that come from remaining engaged, remaining social, remaining active, can help that individual live as long a life as well as possible? I think that the arts role works a little bit like this, and to tell you this I need to tell you a story. So at one point I used to work with people who were extremely creative. They were extremely creative at robbing cars. So every time a new car was produced, these people would come up with a way of stealing the car. And it became a competition between the manufacturers of cars and these young people who were very intelligent and very innovative at stealing cars. So Ford would produce a new car that had a central locking system, and within about 2 weeks somebody would have come up with a way of slicing a tennis ball in half, putting it on the back lock, hitting it with a mallet, and all the doors pop open because the air goes down the cars. It's incredibly innovative. What didn't happen, what was harder, was to engage in anything that required emotional movement, because innovation in that circumstances has direct consequences. So you can innovate to do the task that's set before you, but to innovate around your own behaviour was much more complex. And so that's where the arts came in. So if people were involved in a poetry workshop and they were reorganising words on a page, initially it was a simple mechanical activity. We just rearranged the words. We're maybe not so interested in the meaning of them. But over time, some word in that sentence, some phrase in that sentence, some hyphenated thing would capture something more within the individual. It would capture some part of themselves. They would emotionally invest in that. And over time, the ability to move those words around with on a page became a way to play with your reality in the same way that we talked originally about carnival and costume and playing with the way that you are and the way that you behave in the world. And so that process of how creativity aligns with health or well-being, how it is beneficial in these societal changes that we're talking about, has become something that I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about. And for me at the moment, it reduces to a series of ideas, a series of topics about what the best of this practice has in common. So not what is the best work, but really what is the most interesting work. What does the most interesting work have in common with itself? And my my understanding at the moment is that work has 7 different strands. One strand is about individual choice, which we might think of as agency. That an individual engaged with creative practice at whatever stage of their life has choice, has agency, regardless of where they are on a diagnosis of Alzheimer's and their journey through dementia. The second is about empathy and exchange. What happens between a facilitator or the materials or the art-making process and the individual. The third one is about disrupting. It's about changing the story. The fourth one is about repositioning that story. How do we tell the story? Where do we tell it? The fourth is that it's generally exploratory. And for that to happen, for genuine exploration to take place, there needs to be vulnerability. And the fifth is that it connects and convenes. So the really interesting creative work has at least 2 or 3 of those different headlines. Choice, empathy and exchange, disruption, repositioning is genuinely exploratory. There's vulnerability present in the process, or it connects and it convenes. So I'm going to talk about that on a small group basis, and then I'm going to start to show how those small group projects are starting to build towards systemic shift, how they are acting in the same way that Carnival does, as a layer on reality that allows change to be possible, not just for individuals, but also for systems and attitudes, or attitudes and then the systems that we build that follow them. So the first of these headlines is about agency. Agency, I think, is what happens when individuals lose themselves in creativity. It's about individual work quite often. It's about rearranging the words on a page and disappearing into that page. It's often best measured in terms of time. I started to read this book, I started to write this poem, and blimey, I've forgotten to pick up the kids from school. I've forgotten to go and do. Time disappears really quickly. It's critically important for someone with a diagnosis because they have choice within the art form that they're engaged with. They can move the words around. And even if the rest of their environment is changing, if their position in the world is changing, they can start to reorientate themselves from their engagement with the individual art-making practice. Empathy and exchange, I think, is more about the way that we understand creative forms. So when we talked about the form, about hanging out with novelists, and novelists saying that the thing they're most interested in is the form that allows the story to come through. So we are working with people who are going into territory that we've never been in before. They are living longer, they are living healthier longer than ever before, or they are at increased scale developing chronic illnesses. So they are adventurers into an unknown. And how do we tell the story of that new territory, particularly when the degenerative conditions that people may be living with give them less access to the tools of communication that we would be used to using standard. They may have less language skills, they may have less coordination, mechanical movement. And so the best of the work that's engaging with this complex series of questions is beginning to change the form. So this work is from a company called Spare Tire, UK company, and it's a theatre process, it's a theatre piece, but it's very much based on tactile. Its narrative is touch. Its narrative is about brushes and bubbles. And it starts to engage its audience, and its audience start to tell us about where they are through the language of touch. So there's an empathy between the creative and the people who are co-creating this new story. It's also the type of thing that Rena O'Neill, the choreographer, mentions when she says that as a choreographer, where the work is developed with dancers, by them, through them, each individual's input is incredibly important. So that working with experienced and mature people is great for her as a choreographer because it gives her something she doesn't. It gives her access to an experience that as an individual choreographer she doesn't have access to. She doesn't have access to people who are at that stage, at that point in their life. The third thing is disruption. How do we disrupt a story? How do we stop telling ourselves the story that we normally tell? So these photographs are from a photographer called Aidan Kelly, who set out to document older people with tattoos. And the story he had in his head at the beginning is that older people with tattoos would be old men who worked in the Navy. And instead, he found people like Kathleen. And Kathleen was a carer until the age of 50. She cared for her mum. Her mum died at 50. And at the age of 50, she made a decision. She had a choice. She had agency. And her agency was about having a marker, a small tattoo of a spider on her wrist, which she can cover with a watch or cuff when she feels like it, or she can reveal when she wants to. It was a marker in the stage of her life, and her life had radically changed. And as Aidan went through this process, he became fascinated by who got tattoos and what and where and when and how and why. So not only was the empathic exchange between him, the artist in this case, and the subject changing, but he was disrupting his own story, and in telling this story, disrupting the bigger story. And disruption seems to be a theme that goes through the best creative practice that's in this new hyphenated area between aging and longevity and the development of an Alzheimer's or a dementia or a chronic disease. It happens at all sorts of different levels, in all sorts of different art forms, by all sorts of different people. So this is an orchestra that began in the National Concert Hall in Dublin, called the Blow the Dust Off Your Trumpet Orchestra, and it was an invitation to older people to join an orchestra and perform on the stage of the National Concert Hall. And there are so many disruptive elements within this, it's hard to choose one. Whether it was the individuals who joined because they had always wanted to be on the stage of the National Concert Hall and thought that was beyond their reach, or whether it was someone who in their 90s wanted to take up the violin to become the best violin player they could be, having had a lifetime of experience as something else. But that group also became disruptive of the institution, and so over a long period of time they changed the way that the National Concert Hall worked with its older population. They changed the function and the system of the concert hall and the education department. And one of the things that this group wanted to do was to play outside of a concert hall environment, was to play on the railway station on a Friday night, was to entertain people. And simply by playing on the station, they disrupted the way that people are used to using stations. So they became not just the place that you go to catch the train, but people broke out into dance. People started to play with the space. So the best work has choice, it has exchange between form and the individual, it disrupts the stories that we tell, and it repositions. So this is the work of a Tasmanian company called Creature Tales. Creature Tales work in residential care homes, and they take Carnival into care homes. They take the fun and the joy of Carnival into care homes. They're the only company in the world I know that asks people to fall over in care homes, that bring dance, that look at things like balance. So by bringing the spirit of Carnival and choice and malarkey and disruption into a care home, they start to play with the way that that home is perceived, the story that it tells itself, that its residents tell themselves about themselves, and that we tell about them. It is rare to find a care home where people with early onset Alzheimer's or a mild cognitive issues are dressing the acrobats for their performance. But what that does is it starts to develop new types of relationship within the community of the care home, between individuals in that care home, between staff, and the power relationships between them all. It's a genuinely exploratory piece of work that starts to reposition relationships and narratives of that particular institution. I do simple projects like this, which came from Kilkenny, where a group of older men who were knitters, who were had Alzheimer's in the early moderate stages, but were in a sheltered accommodation unit because they were less able to support themselves, took on the task of knitting, because they could all knit, and knitted scarves and woolens that went to the local Oxfam shop that was sold to support Oxfam projects around the world. And in doing that, they became not the poorest people in their community, but they became the provider of support for other people. They became a place where knitted goods could be made that would support other people. So the transaction relationship started to change. And as I move into thinking about connecting and convening, I need to flag this. So Grayson Perry, the artist, said in a radio broadcast about 2 years that one of the problems is that artists always claim sole rights to creativity, and of course they're not the only creative people in the world. There are creative people in every walk of life. And I'm going to focus a little bit on a project called Meet Me at the Albany to explain how I think the best, most exciting creative work is starting to become an influence of the systemic healthcare systems, health and social care systems, and how that process is working. So, a little background. The Meet Me at the Albany project, which takes place in South East London, began because the local authority of Lewisham recognised it had a problem. As the resources that were available to it for public health were decreasing as a result of central government policy, the increase of people living longer and the increase of people becoming isolated and the increase of people living with Alzheimer's and dementia was placing an increased burden on ever-decreasing support levels. And so they recognised this and described it as a thing called the Brent graph of doom. If we continue to do the same thing in the same way, we will run out of resources to do pretty much anything. And so they opened a bid, a creative bid for people to address social challenges. And an art centre and a theatre making group called Intellically bonded together with a few other organisations to create what has become a radical alternative to daycare. So in essence, this is a club that meets once a week for about 50 people. Its budget is based on an equivalent of daycare provision, so it's like for like. And people come to that group once a week for the full day in the art centre to make things, to explore their own creativity. So some days they do things that are painting and decorating. Some days they just drink cups of tea. Some days they talk. Some days they make circus. Some days they go beyond their expectations of what it was that they thought they might become. And over time, this builds into what we think of as a participant pathway in exactly the same way that there's a patient pathway in a traditional healthcare system. So, people are recommended to this daycare session, partly maybe because they're home alone, they're depressed and they're anxious after a stay in hospital. They may have had a stroke. There's been some change in their cognition, there's been some change in their circumstance within the world. They may be suffering from a mild cognitive, they may be in a process of developing a mild cognitive issues. Their position in the world has changed. They may have had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. They may be challenged by dementia. They attend the Meet Me at the Albany session quite often because they're referred by a social care team. Increasingly, what we're working on is that they become referred by a GP. They start to work with someone in there, and this takes time. So over a gradual period of time, they may find an art form or an individual or something that appeals to them. They start, in the version that we use here, to work with a poet. And they write poetry. They move words around. It becomes a thing that becomes emotionally investment. At some point, maybe they have a small opportunity to perform. Maybe over time they get a book of poems printed, and maybe over time they start to go off on tour. And so their participant pathway has been from defining themselves as the result of a medical condition, of going from being Brian the person with a heart attack to becoming Brian the poet, to finding a new position in the world. If arts are about adaptation and resilience, then maybe they're as valuable or more valuable than anything that medicine has to offer. So that's an individual pathway that takes place within this radical alternative to daycare. And the individuals within that are referred from, or come into that group from very different pathways. They may come from the GP, they may come from family and friends, they may come from voluntary sector organisations that deal with mental health or that are are supporting people who are transitioning into older age or are challenged socially. They may be self-referred. The posters are deliberately designed to make this not look like a healthcare issue, to make it look like a fun, lively event, which it is. And gradually what's beginning to happen is that group is also becoming a place where the social care and support teams can meet large groups of people at one time. What's also beginning to happen is that group is becoming a group where they are ambassadors into old age within this particular area. They're ambassadors into the way that a health or social care system supports them or doesn't. They're becoming the data generating element. And so what's happened over the last 3 years is this has grown from one particular group to a series of projects around a borough, around a particular geographic area. So there is the regular Tuesday session, there's the growth of another large session in a different part of the borough, because one of the challenges obviously is transport and travel. As people become frailer, how do they make it to the sessions? So then what grew in response to that was artists in residence programs, which are either in local community centres or they're in residential care or sheltered living centres. And so as this project grows, what's emerging from it is a different type of relational care that involves art centres, social care groups, formal care, medical care, and systems of feedback loops. So as people identify challenges within the system, it becomes a way that change can happen as a result of prototyping and precedent. That said, there's also a great deal of great art getting made from it. Some of the work that is developed from these groups has gone on to be broadcast on national TV. Some of these groups have gone on tour with shows, so they're starting to take the stories that are about their lives or about the issues that they encounter, isolation, outside of their own environment. They go to talk at conferences. They made a show called Bed, which was an isolated older person who appears in a bed in a street with no signage and acts as a stimulating object that people start to wonder, why is that woman abandoned in the street? What's the story of this? But it causes people to reflect. It works as a piece of street theatre or as a piece of performance art, but it's performed by a 92-year-old that comes from this group. So those stories are disrupting. They're beginning to challenge existing narratives, but they're also placed within both the story that we tell ourselves about ageing, but also the system that we built of care around the story that we tell ourselves about ageing. Which brings me back to festivals. Festivals, I think, are how we start to join these individual projects and the systemic issues together. So if we think about the key challenges, if we think about the stories that we have, the point of view that people take on them, how we connect them, the need to cross from fiction into action, then I believe that festivals, the contemporary carnivals, are where we can really start to do something significant. The key challenges, we could pick several hundred, but for this, I think they're to do with how people plan. They're to do with the political life being shorter than the generational change that's happening as a result of ageing and changing populations. It's all to do with the questions that people ask themselves on the top part of that iceberg. Where are the resources for change? I find it very difficult in my sector to work with another sector because we don't know how to communicate, or, I do this particular thing, but they do the social care and we do the medical care, and there's a gap between us. There's no hyphen. And we can move up and down between individual challenges and then challenges that are at group level, at city level, or at political or policy level, systemic. Festivals, I really believe, offer an alternative to that, and here's why. They are places that people experiment. People go to festivals to try out new food and new dance and new music. They can become places that we try out new ways of ageing, new ways of living with our changing conditions. They can do that by showcasing work of the variety that I've talked about previously. They are extraordinarily good at getting people to try out new things, at overcoming threshold hesitation, whether that's going to look at a new story or trying out a new way of being. They have standard festivals do the same things. They promote. They have a marketing function. They can tell a story in a popular narrative. They bring people together. Things like wristbands and credit cards are massive data gathering engines, but also on-site interviews become incredibly important at collecting data. And they're limited time frames, so they happen, and then they happen the next year, and then they happen the next year, and then they happen the next year. You have a limited amount of time to get involved in them, but they repeat, and that repetition helps to support cultural change. It's more than theory. One of my previous roles was as the director of the Bealtaine Festival, and between 1996 and 2013, it grew from 52 events to 3,500. It grew from 700 partners. It grew from 36 partners to 700 partners. And at its peak, it involves about 112,000 people, which in Irish terms is about 20% of the population over the age of 65. So this is an event that's made of many, many, many small clusters of people, in the same way that the Meet Me at the Albany project works. Many, many, many groups that cumulatively are beginning to develop momentum and beginning to influence change and policy. The festival is very simple. It does what festivals do. It's a month-long celebration of creativity as we age, and it explores the creativity of older people, but also artists' exploration of aging. It's collaborative. It commissions, it produces, it promotes. It brokers partnership, and it brokers partnership around the delivery of an event, not a long-term systemic change, but what can we do in the month of May? It crosses over between cultural institutions, arts institutions, health institutions, academic, education, between active retirement groups, between different parts of the country. It becomes a place of convening and connection. And of all of these groups, they make very different types of work, but that very different type of work cumulatively starts to tell many different stories about the way that we age. Those many stories start to influence, I think, not only the way that we think about aging, whether we age healthily or whether we age with a condition, but about the culture of old age. I genuinely believe that it's beginning to have an effect on the way that we think about ourselves at 60 or 65 or 70 or 75. To give you a small example, this is the Dawn Chorus. It's an invitation to people to get up at dawn and sing on a waterfront, which originally was a beach. And then in the second year became anywhere where there was water, because as people in the Midlands pointed out, we don't have any beaches in Offaly. It's a really simple premise. To get up early and sing on a beach is life-affirming. It costs nothing other than a decision. And over time, as people took that idea and played with it and adapted it to place, many different things happened. So I'll tell the story of Carlo, where an active retirement group said, we really like that idea, it's a fabulous thing, we think we should do this. They did this at the time that the Irish economy was in peril in 2006. So they did this at a time when in Carlo town the population was beginning to emigrate again for work, where there was social uncertainty. And so the active retirement group said, we'd like to take part and make a dawn chorus, we'd like to get up and sing by a beach at dawn, or by the waterfront at dawn, but we don't really like dawn, so can we do it a little bit later? Can we do like 9 o'clock? Because that's the time that we get up at Carlo, that's dawn. And so we agreed, and then they said, we'd like to involve local school kids. We'd like to have them scattering rose petals on the beach. Fine. We'd like to involve a couple of choirs. Yes, that's fine. We'd like to have the local fire brigade blow water across the river to make a rainbow. So what they'd done is the active retirement group had become the grease and glue of community through the creation of an event, through a tiny festival. What they'd done is they'd begun to bring very different organisations into play around this event, which was about the well-being of older people within that environment, but actually was more than that. It was about the well-being of that group during a time of social and economic crisis, when the value of older people was that they'd already lived through several different economic crises. And so they became the grease and glue of that town, and they ran that project for a number of years, and then the project faded away. But it's a great example of how these projects go in an organic process from very local into a much more significant strategy. And that work is analysed by Dr. Anya Nalema and Professor Eamon O'Shea in an evaluation of the Bealtaine Festival, which looked at impact on individuals, impact on institutions, impact on society. That evaluation, together with the growing scale of Bealtaine, had led to things like the National Positive Ageing Strategy, featuring culture as a given term, and gradually the idea of culture and well-being is becoming almost a lingua franca in an Irish arena. And so I'm getting towards the end. I think the joy of festivals in the strategy is that they're a receptacle. They hold all sorts of different ideas and intentions. They become the place that we meet. They also become the place that things that are broken can get connected back together, so that they become a richer element of a society. This is a kintsugi bowl. When they're joined back together, those areas where they break are highlit with gold glue, with gold clay. And I think they're a really interesting way of thinking about what happens as a festivalized process moves existing systems, existing cultures into a way where we can engage with populations aging at scale and the increased incidence of Alzheimer's and dementia. These festivals sit between very many different types of organisation, and they work on the behavioural psychology process that I mentioned at the beginning. So they connect different organisations in the delivery of a project, of an event, of a short term, let's roll our sleeves up and try and make this event happen. Let's address how we encourage people who are living with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's in a residential care home. How do we enable them to be present? How do we hear what it is that they want to say about the lives that they're living? How do we solve this problem? How do we solve the transport problem of getting those people to the event? So they become prototypes for that type of solution. But what they also do is a little bit more subtle. So I think they work on a virtuous circle, and the first part of this circle is that people get curious. They ask the question, what is that thing that I don't quite understand? And if people go beyond that and are engaged with it a little more, they are inspired by it. They want to do that thing. The next challenge is that they gain the skills to do whatever it is that they're curious and inspired by, and then they show it off. And once they show it off, they make more people curious. And it's as true for an 8-year-old child learning to play the penny whistle as it is for an organisation that's developed a radical alternative to care home within their arts centre, as it is for a systemic relationship of care that's developing between arts centres, social groups, health groups, GPs, in order to improve the health and well-being of people living longer within their geographic community. It's very much about how we go from just telling the story into making the story change. And so the work with creative ageing that we're doing is about how do we systemically build a festival model? How do we start with something like the type of project that happened in Scarlo, which is about a small number of people, 200 or 300 people within a town? How do we systemically expand on that? And it's partly about working out how we can codify those processes, but it's also about how we connect from local assets out. How do we build on what is already there? And so over the next 3 years, starting with a project in San Francisco that is connecting work that is already ongoing. We have joined the story as the story is already moving. We're looking to build from a seminar to a bigger festival, from a bigger festival to an influential festival that will work year after year, that will come round and take best practice and amplify it across the city, that becomes a prototype for change. And I believe that's where we are at the end of this talk. we're beginning to talk about a new story beginning. We're beginning to talk about not only what kind of old do we want to be, but what kind of world do we want to grow older in. And I'll finish. Thank you.